Thank you to the conference organizers and Lenka. I'm honored to be here speaking today, and sorry to have to speak in English, but you don't want me to try anything else. I'm here to talk about those who receive disclosures from whistleblowers. I will call them recipients. And although policymakers and most of this conference like to focus on whistleblowers, because of course they are the most prominent central player, those of us who research the whistleblowing process recognize that those who receive the whistleblower complaints are the next most important player because he or she will decide what action will be taken about the complaint. Will the recipient ignore it or work to fix it? Will the recipient retaliate against the whistleblower or try to protect her? So let me start with just a few examples to highlight the importance of these players. People often say that whistleblowers should report internally to their organization, such as, for example, a company's board of directors, who's normally charged with making sure the company acts appropriately. But how does the board of directors do as a recipient of whistleblowing complaints? In 2001 and 2002, the first financial crisis in the United States was set off by enormous bankruptcies, including by WorldCom, a gigantic U.S. telecom company at the time. And you may remember Enron, but WorldCom's bankruptcy several months after Enron's was larger, the largest in U.S. history at the time, and could have been much more devastating. The financial problems at WorldCom came to public light because of a whistleblower's report to the company's board of directors. That whistleblower, Cynthia Cooper, was the head of internal auditing at WorldCom when she discovered massive accounting fraud, errors that ultimately totaled over $9 billion US. After she told the board of directors, the board investigated, they fired the wrongdoers, they disclosed the misconduct publicly, they declared bankruptcy, and then they successfully reorganized as MCI. Shareholders ultimately were paid back billions of dollars owed to them from the fraud. The company's chief financial officer, the company's controller, and the director of audit accounting all pled guilty to securities fraud, and then they all testified against the company's CEO, who was also found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. WorldCom's board, I would submit to you, did its job when it received Cooper's disclosure. Compare this to the second U.S. financial crisis happening in 2008, caused in part by improper use of subprime mortgage-backed securities. For years before the crisis became public, numerous employees at banks across the country tried to warn their boards of directors about the fraudulent subprime loans being made to people who could not afford them and then bundled and sold to unknowing investors. For example, a Citigroup vice president named Richard Bowen, already mentioned today earlier by Mark Worth, has claimed that he repeatedly sent emails to officers and to the board of directors of Citigroup about the massive fraud going on in the mortgage division of the company. Citigroup ended up paying $7 billion US in settlements and fines because of the fraud, but only because its misconduct came to light when everything else in the economy collapsed, not through the actions of anyone who received Mr. Bowen's complaints. No one from any of the banks has gone to jail, and no one's ever been charged with a crime. So, in one example, the board of directors responded appropriately after receiving the whistleblower complaint. The company fired the wrongdoers, disclosed things publicly, ultimately reorganized. The whistleblower actually became one of Time magazine's Persons of the Year in 2002. By contrast, Citigroup's board of directors ignored Mr. Bowen, ultimately fired him. The fraud kept on going until it collapsed of its own weight, nearly bringing down the U.S. economy in the process. So, at least with these two examples, the story is that whistleblowers might get mixed results when they report internally to the highest authority in the organization. So, maybe whistleblowers should tell the government rather than going internally to the board of directors. Well, that can work. To give one quick example, in 2001, an employee at Symbol Technologies, which made barcode scanners and mobile computers, sent an anonymous letter to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which is in charge of law enforcement and regulation for the securities industry. The letter alleged that the company was engaging in accounting fraud. The SEC investigation led to federal indictments for criminal securities fraud against the company's CEO and 7 other executives. It ultimately restated its earnings to erase over $300 million in net income, and it paid a $37 million fine to the SEC and $138 million to settle shareholder lawsuits. But it doesn't always work. You may have heard of Bernie Madoff, the head of what appeared to be an enormously profitable hedge fund that year in and year out made enormous profits. Around 2000, an outside analyst named Harry Markopolos did the math and realized that such consistent profits were next to impossible. So he warned the SEC over and over again that something fraudulent must be going on. Between 2000 and 2008, he sent them no less than 5 letters telling them about this, and the SEC consistently ignored him. Finally, in 2009, in the midst of our Great Recession, the Ponzi scheme fell apart and Madoff turned himself into the SEC. Not because of any action by the SEC, but because the fund could no longer pretend to give the high returns Madoff had promised. He had stolen all of the money and lied about the returns. Ultimately, investors in those funds lost $65 billion. So although Markopolos is not a classic whistleblower because he was an outsider, my focus here is on the recipient of this disclosure, the SEC. And once again, we have the SEC as a government regulator receiving complaints. In one case, they do well. In the other, they don't. Well, if insiders don't always work and government regulators are inconsistent, or dare I say inept, what about going directly to the public? Should a whistleblower use the press to stop misconduct and seek protection? Is the press a good recipient of whistleblower complaints? Well, you may recognize this man. It's Professor Maravec. No, it's actually Edward Snowden, right? How many of you have heard of him before? We'll wait till the translation goes through. Of course, we all know the story about Snowden and his revelations to Glenn Greenwald, the Guardian newspaper, and other reporters about U.S. government surveillance. These reports caused public turmoil, worldwide demonstrations, ultimately forced Congress and President Obama to rework the NSA surveillance authority. He escaped to Russia and is given frequent exposure because of his ability to use the press to speak directly to the people. Stories from the documents he disclosed continue to dribble out 2 years after his first bombshell in 2013. So how many of you have heard of this fellow? Less, I would say. His name is Thomas Drake. 8 years before Snowden came out with his disclosures, in 2005, Thomas Drake told a reporter from the Baltimore Sun newspaper much of the same information about overzealous government surveillance that Snowden revealed in 2013. Some call Mr. Drake and a few others the original NSA whistleblowers. The Baltimore Sun ultimately published some articles about waste, fraud, and abuse at the NSA, but they didn't come close to having the impact that Snowden's revelations did in 2013. Drake himself was hounded for years by the government. He was prosecuted, threatened with decades in jail, before the case was finally kicked out by a federal judge. So again, we have 2 different reactions from the press and the public. Now, some of the difference in these reactions, I have to admit, came because of the type of information each was willing to disclose. Drake refused to disclose classified information while Snowden was willing to do that. But some of the difference depended on the difference in reaction from the recipient, the reporter, and how those stories played out before the public. Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian were masterful in the way they played up the meaning of the surveillance and gained exposure for Snowden. For weeks, if you remember this, the world was riveted by those documents, then by the Hong Kong hotel interview, then by his disappearance and ultimate escape to Russia. I would submit that this press exposure and the public support has helped protect him, well, that and Vladimir Putin. But by contrast, the Baltimore Sun focused on the financial waste going on at the NSA, which never struck quite the same chord with the public. Drake came very close to going to jail for a long time and has never really recovered professionally. He now works retail in an Apple store in Washington, D.C. So I draw 2 important lessons from these sets of contrasting examples, and they are the 2 points I want to leave you with today. First, the recipients of the whistleblower disclosures matter. Will they give advice? Will they help protect the whistleblower? Will they stop the misconduct? Any whistleblower, policy, or law, or program needs to spend some time thinking about the person or the entity who will receive the disclosure from the whistleblower and how to encourage that person to stop misconduct and protect the whistleblower. I just gave you 3 sets of examples of recipients: board of directors, a government regulator, and the press, and yet there were starkly different results from whistleblowing because of the different ways the recipient reacted to that disclosure. The second lesson is that there are no easy answers, like always report to the government, or always report internally, or to the media. The same types of recipients, internal, external law enforcement, or the public or press, can have different reactions and different outcomes because, of course, they're not monolithic entities. They're populated by people and individuals who will react to whistleblower disclosures differently for any number of reasons. Moreover, there are different types of whistleblowing may require different types of recipient systems. National security whistleblowing is different than financial fraud whistleblowing, which is different than whistleblowing about public health and safety. We might balance the costs and benefits to the public of a broad disclosure versus a narrowly defined group of recipients differently depending on the type of information that's revealed. The challenge, given this diverse array of possible recipients, is how to set up the right incentives and environments for both whistleblowers and the recipients to act appropriately. Most whistleblower laws identify possible recipients but say very little about their responsibilities, except perhaps to say that the whistleblower should not be retaliated against. So my topic today will be about the various roles and responsibilities of the recipients and the types of recipients that best support the twin goals of any effective whistleblowing system: stopping the misconduct that's going on and protecting the whistleblowers, and how the law might influence the recipients to support those goals. So specifically, I'm going to spend my time first describing who recipients might be. There are many different examples of various types of recipients we see throughout the world in business and in government organizations. Then I'll talk about the 3 most prominent whistleblowing legislative models in the world today and how recipients might fit into those models. And finally, I'll talk about some of the best practices for developing a law that might influence the whistleblowing recipients and therefore in turn impact the whistleblowing process in order to protect whistleblowers and stop misconduct. So first of all, who are the recipients? The persons or organizations that might be able to affect action in the language of the most prominent definition of whistleblowing in the social sciences. By definition, we're looking at people then, or entities that can do something about the whistleblower disclosure, can stop the misconduct, can protect the whistleblower from retaliation. So generally, we don't think about family members as recipients or co-workers, at least not as formal recipients. And the classic description you will see from most people includes 3 tiers of recipients: an internal to the organization, an external regulator, and the public. Each tier has advantages and challenges for meeting these twin goals of whistleblower protection and stopping misconduct. And this is true in part because each recipient, and not every recipient, has each goal in mind. Some care more about stopping the misconduct than protecting the whistleblower. Some want public exposure, while others want to keep things quiet. Some prioritize protecting the public, while others have the organization's needs as paramount. And within these broad categories are numerous subcategories. The types of people and entities that may receive whistleblower complaints are limitless. Let's see if we can identify some. So, the internal recipient means those that are internal to the organization. They have the same bonds of loyalty to the goals of the organization as the whistleblower. In the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the board of directors at WorldCom and Citigroup, and boards are classic examples of internal recipients. But there are lots of other people that whistleblowers could and do disclose to. There's supervisors and managers, human resource officials, internal hotlines, internal ombudsmen, internal union representatives, C-level officers, chief executive officers. And there are many advantages to encouraging whistleblowers to report internally to one of those recipients. Reporting internally allows organizations to determine where the problems are and how to fix them before small problems blow up into big ones. Organizations can correct misunderstandings and address problems before they get escalated. So in many ways, encouraging internal reporting is more efficient for the organization than when whistleblowers report externally. Not as many resources and energy are spent on responding to external investigations that may end up proving nothing. Internal reporting is less disruptive to the organization. But of course, the disadvantage is that it's very easy to cover up internal reporting. Right? Internal recipients can, what I call, block or filter reports as they move up through the organization. The report and the misconduct with internal reporting are both less visible to the outside world, which reduces the amount of oversight available. Well, how about external regulators? The external regulator is an entity that's responsible to society at large. Usually it's a government regulator or a law enforcement organization. The SEC that I mentioned earlier is a classic example of this tier, but other examples include regulatory government officials like oversight agencies, corruption commissioners, ombudsmen whose responsibilities are to enforce the law and investigate the whistleblower complaint, external auditors, legislative representatives, Congress in the U.S., oversight boards. Reporting externally, as opposed to internally, has some advantages. It might be better from the public interest standpoint because it permits better public oversight and increases organizational transparency. It also encourages better law enforcement. But, as I said before, it can be very disruptive to organizations when whistleblowers report externally. It can impose a great deal of cost on an organization, such as investigative and compliance costs to defend itself when it's in the crosshairs of a government agency, especially if the whistleblower turns out to be inaccurate or misinformed. Another disadvantage is the potential release of confidential business information to the public, which could lead to industrial espionage as organizational secrets get revealed to outsiders. Finally, different agencies can have different missions. Are they supposed to protect whistleblowers, advise them, investigate, or stop the misconduct? Depends on what the agency is. Finally, the final tier of recipients is the public itself. Whistleblowers could go directly to the public rather than reporting internally or to an external government regulator. The most obvious way to do this is to go to journalists or the media, such as The Guardian and the Baltimore Sun newspaper that I mentioned before. But non-traditional media has become an increasingly important place for whistleblowers to go. Internet sites like WikiLeaks, to which Chelsea Manning gave hundreds of thousands of secret U.S. government documents, which then published them directly to the Internet, where anyone could access them. Also, whistleblowers can go directly to the public and avoid the middleman by just going on a blog or using social media. The advantage is that such outlets might provide the most exposure to the misconduct, which would perhaps put more pressure on that organizational misconduct and stopping it. It might be the easiest for the whistleblower to remain anonymous by doing it this way. Think about how many years it took Deep Throat to turn into Mark Felt from the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. But there are disadvantages to this recipient too. For example, going directly to the media or to the public does nothing to stop or punish the misconduct, other than bring attention to it and hope that enough pressure can be created so that the organization will stop it or force the government to intervene. Reporting to the press and the public is also the least respectful of organizational confidentiality. National security whistleblowing is the obvious example of the danger from such reporting, when the danger from such reporting is at its highest, but others exist, such as when a corporation needs to keep a trade secret, for example. Ironically, though, sometimes going to the press is the best form of protection for the whistleblower. In the United States, the media has played an enormous role in not letting whistleblowers get railroaded and covered up. In fact, advocacy groups like Tom's Government Accountability Project, I think, have made it part of a litigation strategy to utilize the media and public outrage to help protect whistleblowers, and it's been very effective. Okay, so those are the three different types, the three tiers, if you will, of types of recipients. It gives us a brief typology of the various possibilities when we think about to whom a whistleblower might report. The next question is, how does a law typically handle the whistleblowing process, and does it favor any type of recipient? And in fact, policymakers, every time they create a law, have to grapple with how to balance organizational and public interest by incentivizing some recipients over others. Some legislation requires whistleblowers to report internally first in order to be protected. By contrast, other legislation forces whistleblowers to be external first and doesn't allow internal disclosures. Some require organizations to have internal channels, but there's not any obligation. And some require a progression from internal to external regulator to media with higher levels of certainty in the misconduct from the whistleblower to move from one recipient to the next. And most importantly, even when a particular recipient is identified by a whistleblowing law, the law itself typically is not very clear on how the recipient should respond to the whistleblower disclosure. And this is true because whistleblower laws vary in their own individual goals. In fact, when we examine laws worldwide, we find that there are basically three models for whistleblower laws, for approaches for dealing with whistleblowers. What I have up there is the anti-retaliation, the structural, and the bounty models. And these various models address recipients very differently. So, for example, the anti-retaliation model, how does it think about recipients? This is the most prevalent form of whistleblower law, and its goal is to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. We've talked about it a lot today. It typically does it, as Mark Worth pointed out, not by actually protecting them up front, but by giving them a legal claim that a whistleblower can use after an organization retaliates against them. This model views recipients as the people to whom a whistleblower can report and still receive protection. If a whistleblower reports to someone not listed in the statute, then they won't have a claim for retaliation and they'll be out of luck. So, for example, under Sarbanes-Oxley in the United States, this law protects corporate whistleblowers who report fraud. And to be protected, the whistleblowers can report to any of those three different types of recipients: external regulatory agencies or a legislative branch, internally to a supervisor, or internally to a person of authority. Report to any of those, and the law makes no preference on to whom you report. Of course, what's missing? The public. There's no protection for a whistleblower that discloses information to the press or to the public directly about corporate fraud. Once the report is made to one of these individuals, the employer is under an obligation not to retaliate. But again, the law doesn't address what the recipient's supposed to do about the misconduct that was being reported, and it doesn't require the recipient to take any action affirmatively to protect the whistleblower. It just prohibits the whistleblower's employer from retaliating based on that report. So compare this to we've talked about the PETA Act in the UK. It's a little different than Sarbanes-Oxley because it takes seriously these different tiers that I mentioned before and shows a clear preference for one type of recipient, an internal one. The law encourages internal reporting first because it requires a higher evidentiary burden for the whistleblower who wants to report externally to a regulator, and an even higher one for reporting more broadly, such as to the press. At each successive tier, the whistleblower must be more sure of the accuracy of the report and the facts related to the misconduct, and the whistleblower's motives will be more closely examined. In other words, it becomes harder and harder for the whistleblower to win a retaliation claim as she goes from reporting internally to externally to a regulator and then to the public generally. PETA anticipates a whistleblower progressing through these tiers, and only the most solid whistleblowing claims with the most impact on public interest will be reported externally. Of course, these laws have other complications, and this is just a quick summary. But my point is that the anti-retaliation model provides a very clear incentive to the whistleblower to disclose to a particular recipient or set of recipients, assuming the whistleblower is aware of the law in the first place. And anti-retaliation laws vary as to whom the recipient should be depending on the views of the benefits that society makes on the balancing between external and internal reporting. In general, the common wisdom is that whistleblowers should have as many options in order to avoid a situation where a whistleblower is second-guessed after a report is made, because although they reported, it wasn't to the right person. But some laws do make very clear choices on who the recipient must be in order to get protection for the whistleblower: internal only, external only, wide open, tiered. Notably, this model addresses only one of the twin goals of whistleblowing legislation that I mentioned earlier, protecting against retaliation. However, it may not even do that particularly well because it only provides an ex post remedy, supposedly enough to prevent retaliation in the first place. But given how hard it can be to win one of these claims, in the U.S., retaliation claimants win or settle only about 20% of their cases generally, the disincentive to not retaliate actually may not be that large. And of course, it doesn't require any affirmative action by an organization to protect the whistleblower. And it doesn't give any incentive to the recipient to actually stop the misconduct. It's simply not addressed by this model of legislation. The hope is that other institutional incentives will stop it, such as criminal law or fiduciary obligations, public pressure, or organizational mission. Another model is the structural model. Laws can require organizations or encourage organizations to implement structural changes and put in clear whistleblower disclosure channels. I've called this the structural model before, and the goal is that by making reporting channels clear, a whistleblower might avoid blocking and filtering of disclosures that often happen when you report up through a chain of command. Laws can create offices to receive complaints, either by encouraging internal structures such as hotlines or agency ombudsmen, or like under this U.S. law, inspectors general who are charged with receiving federal government whistleblower complaints, affirmatively protecting whistleblowers and investigating the underlying misconduct. Or they can identify external offices, such as under the Federal Public Interest Disclosure Act in Australia, which is a great example of the type of details a law can require about a recipient's responsibilities. It requires federal agencies to have specific procedures for handling public interest disclosures, and those procedures must comply with standards set by the principal oversight agency, the Commonwealth Ombudsman. It also requires agency heads to take specific steps to protect the whistleblower from retaliation, which is different than what we saw with the anti-retaliation model. It requires whistleblowers to be kept informed of the progress of the investigation of their disclosure. There's rigorous oversight by the Commonwealth Ombudsman. Finally, the bounty model, which is used primarily in the United States, is where whistleblowers are incentivized to report misconduct by reaping a share of the claims, the proceeds that result from the claims of the report. It works best with financial misconduct, such as fraud or tax evasion, and the recipients in this model are usually law enforcement agencies. In the U.S., it's the Department of Justice or the IRS or the SEC, Office of the Whistleblower. And these recipients are motivated to stop the misconduct because that's part of their job. And the whistleblower, of course, is coming forward in order to get that reward. But there's no provision in these laws for the protection of the whistleblower. Usually they have some anti-retaliation protection built in, but they really have little say, since they are external to the organization, these recipients, on how to protect the whistleblower. So I think we can draw some lessons from these models related to our two goals of stopping misconduct and protecting against retaliation. Each model has something to offer as we think about recipients, but individually they all leave something to be desired. So the anti-retaliation model theoretically protects whistleblowers, but doesn't address that underlying misconduct. In fact, it's often ineffective. The structural model can address the misconduct if the recipient is empowered to do so, but it may not do much to protect the whistleblower. The bounty model is the best incentive to stop misconduct and the most incentive for whistleblowers to report, but it's not widely adopted, and it's often dependent on a long process and an extremely diligent and motivated whistleblower to be able to fight through that process. So, if each of these models have flaws, what would we do if we, started from scratch, like you have the opportunity to do? Who do you want whistleblowers to report to? Internally to the organization, externally to legal regulators, to the public directly? How can you set up a law that satisfies those two goals that I mentioned to you? As I mentioned in the very beginning of the talk, we can think of famous examples of whistleblowing, both successful and not so much, that have used each level. Depending on how you cherry pick these examples, you can argue that certain recipients might do better than others. Whistleblowing systems that choose among these various recipients are often trying to find the delicate balance inherent in a whistleblowing policy between protecting public interest and protecting organizational interest. If we worry that organizations are going to cover up misconduct, we might want to incentivize whistleblowers to go externally. If we're concerned that organizations will lose control over important confidential information and processes, and we trust organizations to clean things up on their own, we might want to encourage whistleblowers to go internally. Despite any normative preference, other factors may outweigh allowing an expansive group of recipients. For example, the U.S. Sarbanes-Oxley Act permits corporate lawyers to report misconduct up the chain of command to the company's board of directors, but does not permit them to go externally because of the high value the law places on attorney-client confidentiality. So the normative choice for the ideal recipient can become even more complex when other considerations are present. Finally, even in systems where there are public accountability agencies charged with receiving whistleblower disclosures and protecting whistleblowers, failures occur. One Australian study examined public sector accountability agencies set up to receive whistleblower complaints from other government agencies, and found significant problems because that external agency simply trusted the whistleblower's own government agency to investigate itself and resolve the whistleblower allegations. And of course, this was problematic because the whistleblower already had reported to the agency that they were in and went externally because that investigation was unsatisfactory. And the laws setting up those agencies, this was before their new law, didn't describe in much detail the actions that that recipient should take. So one way to think about which recipients to favor is to consider what whistleblowers actually do. Who do whistleblowers choose to report to when they encounter misconduct? So what we know from the social science research is that overwhelming numbers report misconduct internally before externally, and many never report externally. Most studies show that less than 10% of whistleblowers report externally, ever. And even those that do report externally almost always start by reporting internally and not receiving a satisfactory response. So you see some results from surveys behind me. I won't take time to go through this. Other than to say that those of us who study whistleblowers have determined rather conclusively that whistleblowers report externally, and I'm quoting from a report, only as a last resort. Expanding upon these U.S. studies, but consistent with them, the Australian Whistling While They Work project found that the vast majority of whistleblowing started 97% and ended 90% as an internal process. Study of the UK Public Interest Disclosure Act claimants found that 91% of those whistleblowers reported internally first, and that 81% of them only reported internally. To put it plainly, internal recipients are extremely important to the whistleblowing process. As a result, it's extremely important to figure out how to affect their behavior so that they handle whistleblowers and their disclosures appropriately, meaning that they stop the misconduct and protect the whistleblowers. Another note from these studies is that they all find that whistleblowers report to multiple recipients. For example, the Australian study found that 50 to 60% of whistleblowers reported to someone other than the initial recipient. So I'm running a little short on time, so I'll skip right to this essential elements part. Unlike studies of whistleblowers, which are relatively commonplace, studies of organizational responses to whistleblowing and recipient behavior are actually few and far between, but they're increasingly becoming the focus of research. But examining what we know about whistleblowers and by using just a little common sense, we think we can make some fairly good recommendations on what should be essential elements for whistleblower laws when they deal with recipients. First, recipients should be responsible for protecting the whistleblower from retaliation, because the anti-retaliation model is often ineffective in that it's an ex post remedy at best. What we need are laws that encourage what some have called protector action, that the recipient take affirmative steps to protect whistleblowers. Professor Lewis mentioned that this is the type of law that's been passed in Australia and Serbia as good examples. Second, laws should identify a wide range of potential recipients, both internal and external, advice and hotlines, ombudsmen, oversight agencies, compliance officers. These can be presented as equal options, like under Sarbanes-Oxley, or tiered, like in the UK or UK's PETA Act, to give incentives to report to a particular recipient first. And we actually don't have good research on which is better. It really depends on the balance policymakers want to make between public and organizational interest. Third, like we've talked about before, there should be anonymity and confidentiality for the whistleblower when they report to that recipient. Talked about that a great deal. Fourth, reporting back to the whistleblower specifically is a very important part that many people have identified. This feedback loop between the recipient on what's happening on the underlying misconduct and the whistleblower is important for the integrity of the system and often provides a check to make sure the recipient's actually doing their job to investigate the misconduct. The Council of Europe 2014 recommendations specifically call for legislation that whistleblowers should be informed about the actions taken on their reports. Fifth, transparency and accountability. Most model laws provide for transparency in the process and accountability from the outside. And that's particularly for government whistleblowers. Results from investigations cannot be kept secret. Unless the whistleblower elects to remain anonymous, the final report and whistleblower comments about that report should be made part of the public record. We have that in our Whistleblower Protection Act in the United States. Sixth, providing independent advice to whistleblowers. Laws typically do not set this up. but as many people have mentioned, it's an important part of the process. They can serve as, outside advisors can serve as recipients as well, but also advice givers. My final point is the ability to influence recipients may be a product of history or culture or the political system. For example, in the United States, it's difficult for the law to mandate structures for private companies. We've had much more success influencing government whistleblowers and private sector whistleblowers through the structural model. Our system historically frowns, in fact, on laws imposing structural requirements on private companies. However, by making the encouragement strong enough for whistleblowers to come forward by giving them financial bounties, we've actually been able to incentivize companies to set up relatively more rigorous internal systems without the necessity of requiring it from the government. That's just a product of our political system. In industries that are already accustomed to strong government regulation, like the nuclear power industry, laws might be more successful. But whistleblowing systems can rarely be a one-size-fits-all system. National security concerns might require different types of reporting channels and restrictions than financial regulation or than public health and safety regulation. So I want to end with a quote many of you should be familiar with, even if it's translated to English. Seek the truth, hear the truth, learn the truth, speak the truth, hold the truth, and defend the truth unto death. The point of encouraging and protecting whistleblowers is to relieve whistleblowers of the obligation of defending the truth unto death. And it turns out that the recipient of the whistleblower disclosure plays a huge role in determining whether the truth emerges, whether wrongdoing gets stopped, and whether whistleblowers get protected. So, recipients matter. They can stop misconduct, they can protect whistleblowers from retaliation, but there are no easy answers. Figuring out the right incentives to make sure recipients act appropriately is difficult and often depends on the type of culture and structures that are put in place. We know what the best practices are, but the fate of a whistleblower system is in the details. How is it run? Who's in charge? What's the tone at the top? Whether wrongdoing and retaliation are tolerated, and how much transparency and accountability there is in the system. Recipients will respond to the system that's in place. My humble advice is to identify as many different recipients for whistleblowers to report as possible, and then give those recipients as much information and authority as they need to both investigate the misconduct that is reported and protect the whistleblowers who report it. Thank you all very much for taking the time to listen to me today, and again to the organizers of the conference. Thank you.